It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Acer XB323U GP. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor would look like firsthand. As usual, there's also a written review accompanying this, or as I prefer to say, this video review accompanies the written review, and you can find a link to the written review in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. So this monitor has a 2560 by 1440 resolution, has a 32-inch panel, that's an IPS type panel, an AU Optronics AHVA Advanced Hyper Viewing Angle panel more specifically, and this gives you a decent pixel density. It's not an amazing pixel density. If you compare this to a 32-inch or around 32-inch 4K UHD screen, so that's 3840 by 2160, the resolution, then it doesn't deliver that kind of experience. It doesn't deliver the same sharpness or clarity. And if you consider a 27-inch WQHD, and again that's 2560 by 1440 monitor, so the same resolution as this, but smaller, 27 inches, then that gives you a bit of an edge as well. Although I wouldn't say it's a massive edge between those two or massive difference between those two. It is subjective. It depends on your own eyes. It depends on your viewing distance and that kind of thing. And I've said before, I personally tend to prefer tighter pixel densities than is offered here, but I still didn't find this one bad. And that makes sense because it's similar to a 24-inch Full HD screen, 1920 by 1080 pixels. And that is a screen size and resolution combination which many are quite familiar with, many are quite happy with as well. But really it's the screen size itself that's the main draw here. The immersion is really good from that. I really enjoy that aspect. I tend to sit around 70 centimeters from the screen, but it lends itself well to sitting further back if you prefer as well. And the resolution does give you a nice amount of desktop real estate. So a good amount of work area there. Nice, useful workspace, good for multitasking, or if you just want to focus on a single document because you're really dedicated, you can have lots of that on the screen all at once. So it's very useful in that respect, good for productivity. Something I like to mention early on in my reviews is screen surface, and this model has what I'd classify as a very light matte anti-glare screen surface, so this doesn't impede the image anywhere near as much as stronger matte screen surfaces, or in fact most matte screen surfaces. So the image has more of a direct look. It doesn't look like there's a kind of a window in front of the image or that there's a layered appearance. It looks quite direct in that respect. It isn't quite the same as a glossy monitor, but it certainly has a more direct appearance than most matte screen surfaces, and I do quite like that. The other aspect when I talk about screen surfaces is the surface texture itself. So this isn't always dependent on how light or unlight a screen surface is. This one has a bit of what I call a light misty graininess to it. So it's not bad at all, and it's really at a level which most users will be perfectly comfortable with. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it is worth talking about this stand because that's really a key feature on this one actually. It's a nice solid powder-coated metal stand. I quite like it. It gives a nice premium look and feel in my opinion. It certainly feels solid. I do like a nice big chunk of metal. It also gives a nice firm footing as well. Nice broad base, penguin foot design as I call it. The top sort of reminds me of an Olympic torch or something like that. It's quite an interesting design the way it flares up at the top. The bottom bezel is corrugated, it's textured. Difficult to see that in the video. If I can get it at just the right angle, you might be able to see that. You can see it has this kind of ridged or corrugated texture. Sort of dark grey, the coloration there. And there's a shiny silver Predator logo in the middle. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so that means they have a slender panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, as well as a slim hard plastic outer component. There's also a little notch. I like to point this out. There's just a little notch at the top left. It looks like a section of the panel border is missing. There's the same on the right side. Perfectly normal. It's used by the machine that puts the panel together. A calibration mark used by the machine. So that's completely normal. The screen surface is what I'd classify as very light matte anti-glare. Now this isn't a scientific classification system, just to be clear. It's just what I feel when I look at the monitor and how layered the image appears when I've got it switched on, and the light striking the screen when I've got it switched off as well. And that means in terms of glare handling, it's decent, certainly compared to a glossy screen, but if you haven't got reasonably careful control of your light, so at the moment I've got light striking the screen directly, regardless of how good your anti-glare screen surface may or may not be, that's going to give you some issues. You can actually see with the most intense light sort of sharper areas of glare, and that's just a bit of a trade-off with this very light matte anti-glare screen surface. But as I mentioned earlier, it has good positive effects for the image as well. So I feel this is a nice screen surface to be used here in terms of its lightness, if you like. And when I'm just using the monitor normally, I've got it switched on, there's light competing, and perhaps I'm a bit more sensible with my room lighting and I don't have light striking directly, just happen to have a door open behind me with some bright daylight streaming in, then things are much better in terms of the glare levels. And either way, as I said before, it's worth paying attention to your room lighting anyway. From the side, the monitor's got quite an interesting design. You can see it's reasonably slender at the thinnest point, then it lumps out centrally, which is quite normal for a monitor, especially when it has this nice big central attachment point. And the stand, you can see it's nice and robust. It's fully adjustable as well. I'll show you that very shortly. You can also see that it has two USB 3 ports. Well, you might not be able to see that they're USB 3 ports, but they are. And the top one there also supports fast charging for connected devices. I think the most interesting part from the side, at least to me, the most unusual, is that little set of 3 metal discs, or what looks like 3 metal discs. And that's part of the swivel mechanism of the monitor, so I'll just show you the adjustability. You can tilt the screen backwards and forwards. It goes backwards quite a way, forwards a little way. You can also swivel it left and right, and if you look at those discs, you'll see how that works. You'll see that the top 2 discs appear to slide over that bottom disc. So it doesn't have a massive amount of swivel adjustment, but just a bit. So that's as far as it'll go either way, a little bit left and right. You can also adjust the height of the screen. It's quite stiff. My unit's very new, and when they're brand new, they tend to be a little bit stiff. But it gives you 130mm of height adjustment. You can see all of the measurements for all of the adjustments in the written review in the features and aesthetics section. You can also rotate it into portrait, and I'm going to be careful about this because it's quite a big screen and I don't want to scrape my desk with it or smash it into my wall. But you can pivot it either way into portrait. I'm going to have to move it a little bit further away from my wall as I don't want to have a nice hole in my wall. There you go, that's nice smooth movement. That was very easy to do. Although I made it look like a bit of a struggle, it was actually quite easy in the end. And just to show you the clockwise rotation, which you can also do if you like, just for completeness. Very close to the desk there, but just make sure that you do tilt the screen back. This goes not just for this screen, but just in general, if you're rotating them into portrait, because you don't want to scrape things. It's not nice doing that. And just to show you what it looks like from a front aspect in portrait, you'll also notice that you can put the screen pretty close to the desk. So there's a very little gap between the monitor and the desk, just enough so that it doesn't smash into its own stand. So that's at its lowest height. And I am going to be drawing a few comparisons with the Acer XB323U GP. It's not a model I've tested yet. Maybe Asus will be able to give me a sample at some point. But for now, I'm just basing this on what I've read, some careful research I've done into that model. And something which is worth pointing out is that with the Asus one, you can't do this. You can't have it rotated, pivoted 90 degrees into portrait. And also the height adjustment is not as good as this Acer model on the Asus. It gives you 100mm rather than 130mm. Maybe small things and insignificant to some people, but just throughout this review I'm going to be pointing out some slight differences between the two models. At the rear, I think the monitor's design is pretty plain, pretty safe really, and especially if you compare to the Asus model, which has a more intricate design at the rear. But I couldn't really care less about that because I have the rear of the monitor facing the wall, and I think most people would as well. So that isn't really an issue in most cases. But it's again the stand, which is the standout feature for me. I really do like the nice solid bit of powder-coated metal. It also has a powder-coated metal edge around it there, towards the top. There is a cable tidy loop, so where I said it flared out like an Olympic torch at the top there, it's actually a cable tidy solution, and you can see those little discs as well. And the stand neck's kind of interesting as well. It looks a bit like a centipede or something like that, so I guess that suits the Acer Predator aesthetic. There's also the Acer Predator logo with the kind of brushed metal finish in the centre there. There's a glossy black plastic Acer logo towards the top right. There is a corrugated texture for the material used at the bottom and the top of the monitor, a plain matte black for the rest. And you can also see the OSD controls, which are explored in the separate OSD video, just towards the bottom left there. The stand attaches by 100 by 100mm VESA, so it's screwed in there. If I remember correctly, and I think I do, it comes pre-assembled in the box, so you can just pull it straight out of the box. Everything is there, the stand, the screen. So that was quite nice, but it doesn't have a quick release mechanism, so you would have to unscrew that. But if you've done that, you've got your own VESA compatible solution you want to use, then you can do that. That's what the 100 by 100mm VESA hold let you do. The ports face downwards, so towards the left side there's an AC power input. That means that the monitor has an internal power converter and doesn't need a power brick. There's also a Kensington lock slot there. Towards the right side of the monitor there are the main ports. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack, two HDMI 2.0 ports. They support up to 144 Hz. At the native 2560 by 1440 WQHD resolution. There's DisplayPort 1.4, and that supports up to 170 Hz at the native 2560 by 1440 resolution. Also adaptive sync, including both AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. Then a couple of extra USB 3 ports, so two more USB 3 ports, so that means 4 in total if you include the ones towards the left side of the monitor, or towards the right if you're looking at it from the rear, as I am now. And then there is a USB 3 upstream port. At the top of the monitor, there are also two up-firing speakers, two 2-watt speakers. I explore them a bit in the written review, but they are super basic. Like, really, I don't like them, to be honest. The sound quality is so poor that I'll do anything I can to avoid using them. They're not completely unusable, don't get me wrong. I mean, they do work, but honestly, as far as integrated monitor speakers go, they're on the lower end in terms of sound quality. Which I feel is a bit of a shame, given the size of screen. Usually on larger screens you can expect more powerful and perhaps richer sound output from any integrated speakers. But in this case, they're really just obviously very bottom of the pile, cheap edition. Most people don't really care about integrated speakers, but if you do, then I'm afraid to say you're probably going to be disappointed by the speakers on this one. Before getting into the main bulk of the testing, I'd like to talk about the DisplayPort on this monitor, because as usual, Acer seems to underspecify the DisplayPort. I've noticed this with Acer specifications before on various things. They seem to kind of underreport certain things and underspecify, which I guess is nicer than the alternative, which is to overspecify, which most manufacturers tend to do. Now, Acer, of course, does this with some things like specified response times. All manufacturers do that, and there's a bit of a stupid arms race going on with them. However, when it comes to the DisplayPort revision, I think it would be nice if they were to correctly specify this on their product page for the monitor, because retailers also copy this information and it's incorrect. So this does have DisplayPort 1.4. If you go into the main menu system, go to System, you'll see it says there DP format DP 1.4. Of course, that could be lying as well, or they could have just said that when it's not. But if you go into NVIDIA control panel or your graphics driver, your AMD graphics driver if you happen to be using that, and I'll also point out this at this stage, if you see any little weird interlaced lines in the video, they're not on the monitor, they're just more away from the camera just because of the distance it is away from the screen. They sometimes come into play, very difficult to avoid them without kind of messing up the video in other ways. So just ignore them, they're not from the monitor. But anyway, you can see here 170 Hz is supported at 2560 by 1440. And also, if you click on Use NVIDIA Color Settings, you'll see 10 bits per channel is also listed as the output color depth, and you can apply that. This is a little bit confusing though, and that does work fine. The monitor hasn't gone crazy or done anything like that. It works fine, but the panel itself uses 8 bits per channel. But what this does is it allows the GPU to use a 2-bit dithering stage on top of the monitor's 8-bit, This is something which is used for HDR. It's actually quite common under HDR for 8-bit panels to do this, to use GPU dithering. Works very well actually. But you can use it on this model under SDR, and that's because DisplayPort 1.4 has sufficient bandwidth to let you do that. If it was DisplayPort 1.2, you wouldn't be able to select 10-bit, it wouldn't even be mentioned there. So I just thought I'd point that out. It is DisplayPort 1.4, in case that's something you're curious about. I mean, it's debatable whether this actually makes any practical difference. If this was DisplayPort 1.2, it would have been DisplayPort 1.2a+, which means it has HDR feature set added to it. And because it is only an 8-bit panel, it doesn't really need this extra capability. Although if you are using 10 bits outside of HDR, working with 10-bit content, I suppose having the dithering stage on the GPU selectable at the same time can be quite useful, and that's what you can do here. According to user feedback I've seen on the Asus model, I just mentioned that quickly, the PG329Q, as I'm sure a lot of you will be considering that at the same time. I haven't tested this monitor myself, but I've done a lot of research into it in various different languages, scouring the deep depths of the internet, and apparently that does actually have DisplayPort 1.2 rather than 1.4, so you can't select 10 bits per channel at high refresh rates as you can with this Acer. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This is an IPS type panel, AHVA panel, so contrast is never going to be its main strength. And in this respect, the monitor performed really as I'd expect for the panel type. I measured a static contrast of a little bit below 1000 to 1 using my test settings, but that's because I had to make quite significant adjustments to the color channels on my unit. You can see the adjustments I made in the test settings section of the calibration section of the written review. Sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful. But depending on the settings you use, you might record a bit above 1000 to 1. So let's just say around 1000 to 1. So that's right on what's specified for the panel, within my expectations, and it delivers a fairly typical IPS type experience. Of course, some models are a bit stronger than that, others a bit weaker. I'm talking about IPS type models here, just sticking with that panel type. But of course, the key thing that defines the experience isn't just the static contrast, and obviously around 1000 to 1 isn't an amazing static contrast ratio. It isn't going to wow you with amazing deep blacks and an inky look to things, but you have to also consider IPS glow. This is a large IPS screen, so IPS glow definitely features, and you can see it quite clearly here. Now, I wouldn't say this is an extreme amount of IPS glow. I mean, there's nothing specific on this monitor that gives it more IPS glow than I typically see on a monitor of this size, or even smaller for that matter. Again, it depends on your viewing distance, because if you're close to the screen, the IPS glow is more noticeable, and with a larger screen, it's just generally more noticeable unless you're sitting quite far away. And it also would be brought out more strongly if your unit has a lot of clouding or anything like that, backlight bleed, that kind of thing. That can bring it out more strongly, or if you're using a high brightness level. So here on my unit, I don't have a particular issue with clouding, but what you can see there is you can see this bloom of IPS glow, and it has a sort of cool tint there. And I find it most noticeable towards the bottom left corner because of this cool tint. It tends to be more noticeable towards the bottom of the screen simply because the ergonomically correct viewing position would have you with your head a little bit above center, so you'd be slightly looking down at the monitor. And that means that the IPS glow, which is angle dependent, would be stronger towards the bottom of the screen. But because it's a large screen, and to be fair, you're going to be probably sitting kind of somewhere in the middle. Again, you may be a bit above center, but you're still going to get a bit of it further up the screen unless you're sitting quite far away and keeping your head very central. But towards the right of the screen, it has a more subdued, warm appearance. It has a slight orange tint to it because of the quantum dots used for the backlight. This has a quantum dot backlight solution, and it has blue diodes with green and red quantum dots. So that gives it a very generous colour gamut, which I'll come on to shortly. But it also means that the IPS glow has a little bit more colour to it than on some models. So it's not such a subdued, warm golden glow. It actually has a bit of an orange quality to it, but it isn't as colourful as I've seen on some models. But anyway, that is what it is. IPS glow, most noticeable towards the bottom left from a normal viewing position. And of course, if you're sitting in a dark room as I am now, not going to give you a wonderful experience. I've let some light into the room now. It's moderately bright now. You can see glare on the screen, and that's exaggerated in the video. Your eyes naturally sort of filter that out much better than it would appear from the video. But the IPS glow is not smacking you in the face anymore. It doesn't smack me in the face anymore. Again, it can be a bit exaggerated on the video, but to my eye there's a clear difference. This really isn't your main concern now. So it is important to be aware of your lighting conditions, and I do suggest that if you do like to sit in a dimmer room, sometimes I do myself as well, but I would suggest having some light around the monitor, perhaps behind the monitor as a bias light, if you can manage it, or just near the monitor. It can help with perceived contrast massively. In terms of the brighter content, I've already mentioned the screen surface, so it has a very light quality to it, which means that it doesn't have an obvious layered appearance in front of the image. It has a bit of a misty graininess, but this isn't a heavy or smeary graininess. So it's actually a pretty pleasant matte screen surface, all things considered, and I think most users will find that element just fine. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction, and to start off I always like to use Lagom, that's lagom.nl, and the tests for viewing angles there. So this Lagom text, it appears with a bit of a red hue, and that's because of the wide colour gamut. That's quite typical for a model with a wide colour gamut, but it doesn't have an obvious shift between red, orange and green, or very saturated elements like that. It's more blended than that, and that indicates a good low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. My unit does have some uniformity issues on this shade, so some areas appear sort of warmer, but this is greatly exaggerated in the video. So to my eye, it's nothing as bad as it appears on the video. But it's worth being aware that because the monitor's colour gamut is very generous, these uniformity issues can stand out a bit more. But it's also exaggerated because the camera just seems to go a bit crazy with the backlight used on this monitor and sort of exaggerates quite a few different things. But anyway, moving on to the solid colours. So the purple block appears a pinkish purple throughout. The reason it's a pinkish purple is again because of the colour gamut, so that the pink elements are brought out rather strongly. But it doesn't have this kind of shift in pink hue that you'd see on a VA or TN model, certainly on a TN model. And actually with the TN model you'd get a gradient from top to bottom. There is a slightly stronger pink hue towards the very edges of the screen compared to the centre, but it's again a lot more subtle than on those other panel types. The red block appears a good consistent, vibrant, actually rather striking red throughout the screen. It doesn't have this kind of quality that you get with TN models where you'd see this gradient from top to bottom where it looks really faded towards the bottom, or VA models where it would look quite accurate perhaps centrally, and further out it can lose some of its saturation or become more faded or duller just generally. So it's a lot more consistent than that. And again, this can sometimes appear a bit weird on the video, but to the eye, nice and consistent. Green block, good solid green throughout. It's a saturated green chartreuse shade, and because of the colour gamut it is a rather vibrant shade on this monitor, but it's nice and consistent. It doesn't have the kind of inconsistencies you'd see on VA or moreover TN models. Royal blue, good consistent deep blue throughout. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. This monitor offers a very vibrant look to the image. There are two reasons for that. One is of course the colour consistency, which I'd mentioned on Lagom, using Lagom as an example. So a given shade looks very similar regardless of where on the screen it's displayed, but that only gets you so far. That does help with the consistency and the consistent richness throughout the screen, but the colour gamut is also very generous on this model. It has a specified colour gamut of 95% DCI-P3, and that's what I recorded as well using my colorimeter. That really only tells part of the story because the colour gamut extends way beyond DCI-P3 in some regions. I actually measured 100% Adobe RGB coverage, even with some extension beyond that. So it's a very generous colour gamut. It uses a quantum dot backlight solution, so it has a blue diode with red and green quantum dots, and they're tuned to give you a lot of energy in the green and red regions, so that gives you a nice wide colour gamut. It certainly is apparent when you're using the monitor. Things are very vibrant, very lively. So there are lots of reddish hues on this particular scene on Battlefield, or shades which contain red components. So even the fields there with the yellow, really eye-catching. There's some amazingly deep and vibrant reds, but it's worth bearing in mind that it doesn't give you the kind of cartoonish, as I'd call it, look that you get if you digitally alter saturation. So you boost the saturation in the OSD of a monitor, or you use NVIDIA's digital vibrance control, that kind of thing. Because what that does is it doesn't make the most saturated shades any more saturated. It doesn't adjust your color gamut in any way. It simply pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut. So a lot of shades appear more saturated, but the most saturated shades don't appear any more saturated. Crushes things together, you lose shade variety. With a wide gamut, like you have here, a very generous gamut in this case, things maintain variety, they maintain appropriate spacing on the gamut, but it certainly makes things look more saturated than they should, or the developers intend. So you've got to remember, I'm running this game under SDR, and like most content you consume, including games under SDR, it's designed with the sRGB color space in mind, so that's what the developers have in mind when they're creating the content. So if you've got a wider color gamut like you do now, things do appear more saturated. Some users really like that look, and it's not just the reds. I was just using that as an example because this scene is full of these really vibrant looking reds, and they're really quite arresting vibrancy for some of these shades, very eye-catching. But there are some nice deep greens as well. So the greens for this moss, for example, have some nice deep green components, and there's some really nice lush forest greens as well in other scenes. This one isn't really so good for showing you those particular shades, but they're certainly deep, certainly eye-catching, rich, vibrant in a way that you wouldn't get on a model with a lesser color gamut. But you also have to be aware that there are certain components within those shades which are brought out too strongly. So some of the yellowish greens over here for that bush is a good example of this. The yellows are brought out too strongly, so it makes it look kind of weird. And for the reddish browns as well, the reds are brought out too strongly. So again, these shades really, they appear less neutral than they should and more red than they should. And you get the same thing with skin tones. Some skin tones appear more reddish than they should. So it is worth being aware of this. And woody tones as well. Again, you can have some elements there brought out too strongly, some red elements brought out too strongly. The red of that flag as well is incredibly deep, but again, some people really like this look, and again, it's varied, so you don't have to worry about that particular aspect, but it's just really, I think, very vibrant is the way I'd describe the output from this monitor. Fires as well, I'm just going to set off a nice little explosion here. Yeah, run away. Okay? So the fire here, it has some incredibly deep oranges and yellow shades as well. It looks nice and vibrant, but really it's overdone. So the yellows verge on orange, oranges verge on red, and the fire just magically disappears all at once when I was trying to talk about it. But I think you get the idea. Just more saturation than they should be, a more saturated representation of things. If you prefer things to be toned down a bit and look more as the developers intend, rather than having this extra saturation, then you can apply the sRGB emulation setting. So if you go into the color section of the OSD, and then go to color space and change that to sRGB, this activates the sRGB emulation setting. This greatly restricts the color gamut. Things are now displayed more as the developers intend, and it does a very good job at clamping the gamut close to sRGB. I explore this in the written review. I definitely recommend looking at the start of the colour reproduction section, which looks at all of the gamuts and compares sRGB to the native gamut and that kind of thing. So that will give you an appreciation of just how wide the native gamut is and how well the sRGB emulation setting does to clamp the gamut close to sRGB. Another nice thing is you get the flexibility to adjust brightness with this sRGB emulation setting. So not all monitors let you do that. That's a nice flexibility to have. Now, I know I like to compare the Acer XB323U with this model. The sRGB emulation setting on that, at least according to the research I've done, including looking at the user manual, that suggests that you can't adjust brightness with the sRGB emulation setting. Now, of course, I don't like to be overly critical about models which I haven't used myself, and obviously I think the Asus really is quite similar to this model in many ways, and I think it's going to give a very nice experience as well. But that is something to consider. If you do like to use sRGB emulation settings, the Acer here has the better flexibility. It doesn't have complete flexibility though. You can't change things like the color channels or the gamma, things like that. As usual, they're grayed out and you can't adjust them. But even so, I'm well aware that some users like to use this kind of setting and they like to be able to adjust brightness when they're doing so. So you can do that here. The monitor also supports HDR, high dynamic range. So I'm going to talk about that now. To activate HDR on this monitor, it's a bit different to most monitors, and I've noticed this on Acer models before actually. With most monitors, you can just activate HDR, so that would be an in-game toggle in most cases, or if you want to use it on the desktop or with applications like the Netflix app on Windows 10 that doesn't have its own toggle. Some games as well, you'll have to do this. Then you'd have to go to Display Settings and click this Use HDR button there. You'll then notice things look really odd and flooded and weird. Now, I wouldn't recommend you use HDR in an SDR environment as I am now, just on the desktop anyway, just without any particular application open. But you actually have to go into the OSD and activate HDR there. So there are a few ways you can do this. There is an HDR preset here. So I've got my HDR signal activated and I can go on HDR there. Alternatively, you can change the color space, which I showed you before with reference to sRGB, change that to HDR. But the main way is actually to go into the picture section of the menu and change HDR to one of the settings. So there's auto and there's, well, I'll show you auto first. There are two different HDR settings. So auto and display 600, I think it's called. So basically auto fixes up your colors. I wouldn't recommend using this in SDR though, when you're not actually specifically wanting to use HDR, because it does lock the brightness off and it's very bright. Things are too bright and you can't adjust anything else really. You can't adjust the color channels or anything like that, or the low blue light settings, that kind of thing. So really the monitor just takes control. This is again very usual under HDR for the monitor to do this. There's close coordination between the monitor and the GPU and the actual application itself, so that's how this works. The other thing to be aware of, just before I move on to the differences between the two HDR settings, is that there is a setting called super sharpness, and that's actually on by default. I've turned it off, but it's on by default under HDR, and that's just a sharpness filter. If you like that, then leave it on, fine, use it, that's fine. I prefer the more natural look without that on. So with this setting, the whole backlight is at a very high brightness. I measured above 600 candles per meter squared, so it's Better Display HDR 600 certified, so part of that is that it has at least 600 candles per meter squared that it can pump out, and this model can certainly do that, no problems. I think I actually measured closer to 700 candles per meter squared. You can see exact figures in the written review, but what this means is that if you have dark content on the screen, or mixed content for that matter, it might look quite deep on the video, but to my eye, that black does not look black at all. It looks really very greyish. So if I make it full screen, it might be clearer what's going on. You can now see IPS glow because I've got the camera close enough to the screen to show that. And actually that element's exaggerated on the camera, but you can quite clearly see now that the depth of the black is just rubbish. It doesn't use any sort of dynamic contrast. This is with the auto setting, be aware. So, don't close the video and kind of rage quit, so to speak. It's just this HDR auto setting that does this. If you switch to the HDR 600 setting, that will activate local dimming on the monitor, and I'll explain how that one works. This can only be used under HDR. You can't use this in SDR. So you'll now see that things are a lot deeper. You can see some IPS glow. The camera does capture this a bit strangely, to be honest, but it clearly looks a lot better than it did with the HDR auto setting. The monitor actually uses local dimming now. It has 16 dimming zones, and they're arranged as 16 little LED clusters along the bottom edge of the screen, and they're individually addressable. So light guides are used to create these 16 different dimming zones as vertical bands on the screen. So of course it's a 32-inch monitor, Having 16 dimming zones is hardly incredible if you think of how many millions of pixels there are on the monitor. It doesn't give you amazing precision or anything like that, but what it does do is instead of the whole screen looking like this band does there, just that band on the screen looks like that. So it allows you to have superior depth for the darker shades, whilst some shades appear very bright, which is sort of a key part of what HDR does. To give you some better context, I'll look at some in-game examples using Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And you'll also notice that the dimming zones are very reactive. There's no lag, there's no kind of strange trail of LEDs as you get with some FALD, full array local dimming solutions. Although I have to say that more modern FALD solutions, especially with G-Sync Ultimate displays and that kind of thing, they tend to be really fast as well. But I have used some older models with FALD solutions where there's a lot of lag with the dimming zones, and that can be very annoying, especially when you're gaming. This monitor is very reactive, the dimming zones are very reactive in that respect. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I've got the game running in HDR, and I'm going to talk about HDR using some in-game examples, which are of course more relatable and more realistic than looking at a black screen fill with a white mouse cursor moving around all over it. So the local dimming solution is again used, so it's fully Vestas HDR 600 certified, and that does require some degree of local dimming, which this monitor does offer, as I've demonstrated. So for this scene here, it of course isn't the same as just pure black. It has some very dark shades, but it's got some somewhat lighter shades. But the depth of this particular scene is actually quite nice. It is certainly deeper than it would be if the monitor was just pumping out its full luminance under the auto mode or something like that, or even if you were just using the monitor normally with high brightness. But the level of detail is still actually very good. This isn't because of local dimming or anything like that, because of course, as I've demonstrated, there are 16 dimming zones. There aren't millions of dimming zones or thousands of dimming zones. And that's the kind of solution you'd need to really account for those intricate mixes you get here. So you've got some very dark shades and somewhat lighter shades and lighter shades again. So the local dimming can't account for that kind of thing. However, there's also 10-bit color reproduction being used, and that increases the nuanced shade variety. So there's a better variety of very closely matching dark shades, and that really helps give a more realistic look to shaded areas like this, to shadow detail, lifts it out a lot more. So that's really nice. So that's a really nice aspect of HDR. It also applies for brighter shades, and I'll come on to that shortly. But just the local dimming does help here. So the daylight there is really very bright indeed. It really has a very natural quality to it actually, whereas the darker areas surrounding that are much dimmer. They're not super dim though. I have to stress that the dimming zones can't just completely shut off again because it's not pure black that's being displayed there, but they are at least dimmer than the central dimming zones, and they're dimmer than the screen would be as a whole if it wasn't using local dimming. So it still gives you a nice edge in terms of contrast, a situational edge. But you can see some shifts with the dimming zones as you move things around. You can see them kind of go dimmer and lighter, sort of like a dynamic contrast setting, but zonally controlled. So, I mean, that's what it is. So that's something which perhaps some users won't like. And I mean, the alternative would be to use the HDR 400 setting, which really isn't attractive at all. Anyway, looking at these brighter shades, so this is why I really like this scene, this particular part when you dive into this water. This really sets apart good HDR performers and not so good HDR performers. And this one, I'm pleased to say, is one of the better HDR performers for this scene. So it has a nice natural look to things. The brightness up there is really nice and bright. That glint there is really nice and bright as well, very eye-catching indeed. So the dimming zones for this really bright content, they're lit up a lot, and a lot more than the dimming zones showing the darker content. And again, whilst I say darker content, it is of course mixed. There's a mixture of shade depths there, and ideally you'd have the shadow detail looking a lot darker than it does, a lot deeper. But again, it's all about the improvement you get with that side of the screen versus that side of the screen, and the improvement you get over no local dimming being used whilst the monitor's still pumping out that sort of extreme brightness level. So yes, the local dimming does really add something in this case. It's not perfect, but it still helps. coming back to that 10-bit colour reproduction, you can just see a big ball of light on the video at the moment, but that's just because of how the camera captures things. If I adjust the exposure, you should be able to see a more accurate representation of things. But of course, be aware that it isn't an HDR video. You may well not be using an HDR screen or using it in HDR. In fact, you're probably not whilst you're watching this video. So in no way are you getting an accurate representation of things. But the reason I've adjusted the exposure is just to show you that, or explain to you that there is a really nice nuanced shade variety for these brighter shades as well. So it's not just a big ball of light, it actually has this lovely array of different shades and really nice smooth gradients, which are much smoother than you see under SDR. So these weather effects and other fine gradients are really aided by this 10-bit colour reproduction. It's also worth bearing in mind, as I mentioned before, it's an 8-bit panel, so it uses GPU dithering to fill out the extra information for the 10 bits. And I've honestly tested this on a lot of monitors now, including some where they'll use GPU dithering at some refresh rates, whereas they'll use monitor side dithering at others, just depending on the bandwidth. And of course, these are panels which are capable of 10-bit processing, even if it does use dithering on the monitor side. And this comparison, it's one I've done many times before, and I've looked at a lot of different content. And with some side-by-side comparisons, very carefully done with very specific content, you may be able to see some slight differences. I'm not saying there's no difference, but honestly, don't worry about the fact it's using GPU dithering. It works very well indeed. The other important aspect of HDR is colour reproduction. This monitor's colour gamut, as I mentioned before, it's very generous and it actually extends beyond DCI-P3 in some regions. 95% DCI-P3 coverage. That's because there is some underextension of DCI-P3 for some shades, but then again there's a lot of overextension for other shades. This is good in terms of the HDR performance. So the long-term goal for HDR is actually good coverage of the Rec 2020 gamut, but game developers have a more immediate goal in mind that things should look at least decent with the DCI-P3 colour space, because that is more attainable, and they're well aware that that's a restriction that most screens have under HDR as sort of the near-term goal. And with this in mind, the colours that are produced on this monitor, it's toned down a lot compared to SDR, so you don't get the oversaturation, so reddish elements, and that includes Lara's skin here. She's got a bit of a tan, but she really kind of looks almost sunburnt under SDR. That's completely gone. Her hair as well, it has much less of a red push compared to what it had under SDR. These green shades as well, there are some lovely, really deep, lush greens here, but the yellowish greens don't stand out in the same kind of artificial way as they do under SDR. And that's because, again, the gamut is more appropriate to the content. It's a better match, so you don't get that kind of oversaturation. You get plenty of shades which are well beyond the sRGB colour space, but that's intended, and that's what this monitor is able to produce. And I'm also going to mention at this stage, I'm using the monitor with a PC game at the moment. I'm using DisplayPort, but I've also tested on an NVIDIA and AMD GPU. I'm using my NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment. Yes, lucky me, I managed to get one. And HDR on my AMD GPU, my 580, looked very much the same. And it's really the monitor I'm talking about here, the monitor's capabilities. I also tested using HDMI because sometimes monitors perform a bit differently under HDR with HDMI versus DisplayPort. On this one, very similar experience using DisplayPort and HDMI. So that's of course important for games console users, HDR games consoles, because they're going to be using HDMI. I'm now on a different scene just for a bit of variety. Still got HDR running, full VESA Display HDR 600 compliance in effect. And again, the colours, really nice array of greens. There's some really nice lush deep greens, well beyond what you'd see with the sRGB colour space. In fact, some of them beyond what you'd see with DCI-P3. And again, there isn't this kind of horrible push towards obvious yellowish greens where the yellow elements are far too strong. And you're not going to be able to see this on the video. Again, it's not an accurate representation on the video, but certainly it's quite a nice HDR experience overall in terms of the colour and indeed the contrast, but just focusing on the colour for now. So it is nice to have this level of vibrancy, and also the blues of Lara's dress here, really nice, and the clothes of this guy as well, the oranges, the reds, nice richness, whereas the skin tones look in place as well because the gamut's being used appropriately. So there's plenty of vibrant elements, and that's what I'm trying to get at here. Plenty of vibrant elements, but the more muted and natural shades look as they should. So really good colour reproduction under HDR on this one. And this scene as well, it looks really nice, a nice natural daylight look to things. Again, the local dimming helps there because the brightest elements look nice and bright and darker elements look a bit darker, dimmer than they otherwise would. And that really does help give a nice natural look to things. And of course the 10-bit processing, again, that helps in this respect. But it just overall a nice look to things, a nice look to these daylight scenes. Of course it would help to have more dimming zones. That would always help. I mean, if you look at the scene here, for example, there's a huge intricate mixture of light and dark. And actually, it isn't just games that I've tested on this monitor under HDR. Netflix, there's quite a lot of Netflix content. I use the Netflix app on Windows 10. There's plenty of HDR content on Netflix now. And I really enjoyed using that. And this is a big test for whether I actually enjoy using HDR on a monitor or not, whether I'll bother using it on Netflix. And I did in this case, and I actually found it added an extra element to things. So even things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So I was watching David Letterman, for example, and the way that the studio was set up, and I'm not going to show you this for copyright reasons. I don't show Netflix content, but the way the studio is set up, it has David Letterman on one side, the guests on the other side, and a fairly dark studio with a few lights lighting it up in between. And David Letterman's hair had this kind of angelic silver glow. And this isn't a glow because there's sort of a halo effect, because this monitor doesn't have enough dimming zones to really have a strong halo effect in that particular respect. But it's just the highlights really under HDR which can stand out, and that's just something you don't get under SDR. And I really felt that it sort of added an extra depth to things when David Letterman was talking to his guests. Sort of the guests stood out in a special way, and I kind of liked that glint on his silver hair. I know I'm being very polite by calling it silver, the hair, but I think it was appropriate in this case with the light shining on it. And it was really nice, but the depth of the studio could have been better. So as I mentioned, it wasn't just pure black, it had a few lights here and there. So the monitor's backlights with the dimming zones, with the 16 zones, that sort of vertical bands if you prefer, it doesn't have enough precision to make the darker shades super dark. But I still felt it added something. And sometimes he's talking to the guests outside, sort of strolling the city where they grew up, and the highlights, for example, sun reflecting off lightly painted objects, that kind of thing, really brought out very nicely. And the local dimming did help with that, keeping the brighter elements looking much brighter than some of the much darker elements in the background. So overall, I really did enjoy the HDR experience on this monitor. I think it works quite well as far as monitors with just 16 dimming zones go. It has a good peak luminance, which helps the bright content stand out well. The local dimming does help give a bit of extra depth, bit of sort of situational improved contrast. Of course, it would have been nice to have many more dimming zones, but this is still such a nice upgrade over most monitor HDR experiences where you just have a single dimming zone or perhaps just a couple of dimming zones. So, 16 is still a reasonable number, still better than what most monitors provide. Add that to the generous colour gamut. I did really enjoy using HDR on this monitor overall. I'm on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor supports a 170Hz refresh rate, so that means you're getting almost 3 times as much visual information outputted every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz. You can see my frame rate in the top right there, 170 frames a second nice and solidly. There might be very occasional dips below that, but it's really pretty solid at the moment, and that means I'm making the most out of the monitor, with my frame rate nice and high, matching the refresh rate. So what this does for you, this high refresh rate and frame rate combination, it improves what I call the connected feel. This describes the precision and the fluidity you feel when you interact with the game world, and interact with the character. And this is something which is greatly enhanced by an increased frame rate and refresh rate combination. It's also important to consider input lag when it comes to connected feel, because having this nice high frame rate and refresh rate is great, but if you've got lots of input lag, that isn't going to give you a nice connected feel. But the input lag on this model is nice and low. I measured under 4 milliseconds, and that indicates a good low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel, so that shouldn't be an issue even for sensitive users. The other aspect of this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it greatly decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. So the concept of perceived blur is an important one to grasp when it comes to monitor responsiveness, and it's explored in our article on the website all about monitor responsiveness and summarised in the written review as well. But basically it's tightly linked to your refresh rate and frame rate, and if you've got a high refresh rate and a suitably high frame rate, you have a reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement. And when it comes to perceived blur, the other side of the equation is the pixel responsiveness. And just before moving on to that, you might be able to see some vertical lines on the screen. That's actually moire from the camera. It isn't anything you can observe on the monitor itself, so don't worry about that, don't freak out about that. But the pixel responses of this one, I'm actually very impressed by its 170Hz performance. At the moment I have Adaptive Sync active, and it's important to note that that locks your pixel overdrive setting. It's called overdrive on Acer monitors. I don't know why they separate overdrive. It's usually one word. But anyway, they call it overdrive in the OSD. You can see it's grayed out. On some Acer monitors, you can set that before enabling Adaptive Sync, and then you can enable Adaptive Sync and it will pay attention to the setting that you had before enabling Adaptive Sync. Other monitors, you can use Acer's display widget to change this, and it will change after the fact, so to speak. But on this one, it's always locked to this normal setting. Now, the normal setting is definitely my preferred setting, especially at these higher refresh rates. And it is also worth noting that the normal setting with Adaptive Sync on is slightly different to the normal setting without it on, but only slightly different, so slight that I'm actually not going to go through this in the video review. But you can see some good demonstrations of this with the pursuit photographs in the written review. And essentially having Adaptive Sync enabled actually gives you slightly lower overshoot, which is actually quite nice, without any clear negative implications. But the normal setting with Adaptive Sync disabled is pretty similar and well tuned for these nice high refresh rates as well. So there really aren't any standout weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. This is very impressive. It's actually one of the most impressive high refresh rate 2560 by 1440 models I've come across in terms of its pixel responsiveness. I'd say it actually edges out the ViewSonic XG270QG and other nano IPS models. I'm not saying there's a dramatic difference, and they're not bad by any means. That is quite a strong benchmark they set, but there's what I like to describe as powdery trailing that you'll see in places on IPS type monitors. And with this monitor, there's really nothing to speak of in terms of powdery trailing. There's a little bit, so around where it says motor trial here and the white icon in the background, there's just a little bit, and I mean it's very faint. You won't be able to see it on the video. What you see on the video is not really what you'd see on the monitor at all, but to my eye it is something I can just about see when I'm specifically looking out for it, but it just doesn't catch the eye. It doesn't really have a noticeable impact on the overall perceived blur, and most of the pixel responses are fast enough for an optimal 170Hz performance, so that is really quite impressive. Sometimes I like to show you scenes where there are lots of darker transitions to try and focus on these darker transitions. So it's mainly medium to light shades here, but there are some darker shades dotted around the place. If I look at a scene with just these darker shades, it doesn't actually highlight any additional weaknesses which are really worth mentioning. On the nano IPS models, for the darker shades, there are actually some slight weaknesses which are beyond what you see on this monitor. So it's just worth mentioning. I think they've done a really good job at tuning this for the high refresh rates here. So for example, the dark element there with the medium shades in the background, the lighter to medium shades in the background, there's really just nothing that stands out. There is a little bit of overshoot in places, so it is a fairly strong level of greater grey acceleration that's used, an effective greater grey acceleration. But this overshoot is not eye-catching, it's not strong at all. And I've just seen here, again, the faintest whiff of this powdery trailing. It really sticks so close to the object and is very light. And that's why I like to call it powdery trailing, but really a very light, fine powdery trailing. And I'd certainly recommend you look at the pursuit photographs in the written review so you get a better idea of what I'm actually talking about here. But in the way of overshoot anyway, There's just a little bit of halo trailing, so it's slightly brighter than the background shade and indeed lighter than the object shade, but it's really faint and well blended. It's not kind of smack you in the face overshoot like you see on some models, certainly not at these high refresh rates. I will of course come on to what happens at lower refresh rates when I talk about adaptive sync very shortly, but when I compare it to my main gaming monitor, which is the Dell S2716DG, I do still use that as my main gaming monitor. And one reason I haven't replaced that, or a collection of reasons really, is that it makes a nice reference because it isn't a perfect monitor. No monitor's perfect. But when it comes to responsiveness, it basically has a moderate amount of overshoot, but very snappy pixel responses. And I'm pleased to say that this monitor, the snappy pixel responses, they're very much there. It also has a high refresh rate, which I do notice, even coming from 144 Hz, I do notice this slight bump up to 170 Hz. I wouldn't say it's dramatic, but it does give a little bit of an edge, and I quite like that myself. But really the pixel responses are just as impressive, and actually more impressive because they're obtained without this strong overshoot. As I mentioned just before, the monitor does support adaptive sync. That means you can use AMD FreeSync if you've got a compatible AMD GPU, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode if you've got a compatible NVIDIA GPU. You can also use HDR at the same time as adaptive sync with either GPU vendor. I'm currently using an NVIDIA RTX 3090, I know, lucky me. So I use G-Sync compatible mode at the moment, but I tested with an AMD Radeon RX 580 as well, and the experience with AMD FreeSync and G-Sync compatible mode is very much the same on this monitor, or certainly was with the NVIDIA GPU I tested. So what this does is it gets rid of tearing and stuttering where there are frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. So I've got my frame rate at the moment, I've increased the graphics settings so that my frame rate is hovering around 120 frames a second, more or less. The monitor is now setting itself to a refresh rate that matches that. Without adaptive sync, it isn't able to do that. It would have just stuck at the 170 Hz that I'd selected. And that would give you obvious tearing if you had VSync disabled, or it would give you obvious stuttering if you had VSync enabled. When I say obvious, it's very subjective. It's obvious to me and people who are sensitive to tearing and stuttering. Not everyone is so sensitive to this, but to me it's really nice having these interruptions removed. It really does give a much more fluid experience. But the reduction in frame rate is still noticed, so there's a bit of a drop off in connected feel. Of course 120 frames a second is still a decent frame rate, but compared to 170 frames a second there's still a drop off in connected feel and a bit of an increase in perceived blur as well. But the pixel responses are again nicely tuned here, just using the only setting you can with adaptive sync active, the normal or close to normal setting I should say. The overshoot levels are increased a bit, but they're not extreme. So I can see some examples of this halo trailing I mentioned before, which is a bit more noticeable now, around the wall there, for example. But it doesn't smack you in the face still, and it isn't something that's actually going to be clear in the video, I'd imagine. And if you do see some things in the video, it can actually be from your own monitor as well, so it's very difficult to assess this in a video. I can see it around the palm tree as well. So yes, there is an increase in overshoot, and if you're super sensitive to overshoot, I think it's a shame that you can't adjust the pixel overdrive setting. So the off setting, I do explore the other settings in the written review, by the way, with the pursuit photographs, so if you're interested, do take a look at that. But the off setting at this kind of refresh rate still does a decent job. It does give you some more powdery trailing though. I actually prefer using normal or the normal like setting, even if there's a bit of overshoot. That's just my preference. But some might prefer the off setting, but if you're using adaptive sync, you don't get that option anyway. So there's also a bit of overshoot just behind this block here. I've increased the graphics settings further, so I'm now a little bit under 100 frames a second, so I'm actually into the double-digit refresh rates now. So the monitor's running under 100 Hz, and the overshoot is somewhat more noticeable now, that halo trailing that's brighter than even the sand in the background in this case. And I can also start to see it up there as well. A bit of halo trailing up there. Might not come across in the video. If you're sensitive to overshoot, I accept this can be quite bothersome to some people. It's there. And again, if you've got adaptive sync active, you can't turn the overdrive down, which is a bit of a shame. I do like to have a bit of flexibility with the overdrive setting, and I like to be able to tell users that it can use different settings. But what's even better than that is if the monitor supports variable overdrive, which this one doesn't support, and that would mean that the pixel overdrive is retuned as the refresh rate changes. So with models like this, they're tuned with the 170 Hz maximum refresh rate in mind, and certainly are with the normal setting. And as your refresh rate decreases, voltage requirements are actually quite different, but the pixel overdrive doesn't retune itself. Therefore, you get an increase in overshoot. Things are kind of a bit overdone. I can also see a little bit of where it says open range, there's a bit of what I call shadowy trailing. So that's dark overshoot trailing, which is darker than the background color, but it's again not extreme, not super eye-catching. I've now got the game running at 60 frames a second. The monitor is running at 60 Hz. I've actually achieved this with a frame rate cap, just for disclosure purposes, because my RTX 3090 is actually very difficult to get it this low on this scene. By just adjusting the graphics options, it would need some rather extensive tweaking. So it's easy to just use the game's built-in frame rate cap, which has exactly the same effect. The monitor's running at 60 Hz now in the variable refresh rate environment. And now the overshoot is certainly more noticeable, especially if you're comparing to 170 Hz. So there is some fairly bright halo trailing in places. You can see it, at this point you should be able to see it in the video around the wall there, to the left of the wall when I move the camera. And I always say that you should be able to see it in the video, but I can't guarantee that you can. But to my eye, I can certainly see it. It's quite bright, quite colourful. I still wouldn't say this is extreme overshoot. And extreme overshoot would be if you set the monitor to its extreme overdrive setting, regardless of what refresh rate you're running at. But of course, you can't do that with Adaptive Sync active. But if I disabled Adaptive Sync and showed you extreme, I might do that later if you're lucky. But it's a bit of a waste of time because everything just looks disco-like and the overshoot is ridiculous there. And as usual, the monitor only includes that mode so that they can be very generous with the pixel response times they specify, and Acer are certainly not alone in doing this. All manufacturers actually do this. So I'm not trying to pick on Acer here, but the extreme setting's really just pointless in reality. The offsetting, though, that could have been preferred. If you look at the written review, you'll see that the pursuit photographs at 60 Hz actually look rather nice with the offsetting. There's no overshoot, and there's really very little weakness to complain about. It actually is a very solid 60 Hz performer with overdrive set to off, whereas with the normal setting, you do get this more noticeable overshoot. So the Asus PG329Q would be a good time to mention this. Apparently that has variable overdrive. I haven't tested it myself, and curiously this isn't something which users have made a big thing about who have tested both the Acer and the Asus models. So perhaps it's that the variable overdrive isn't tuned that well, or perhaps it's just that this overshoot issue that I'm talking about here at these lower refresh rates, maybe it doesn't necessarily bother people so much, or maybe they're actually gaming at high refresh rates than this anyway. But it is worth mentioning that it does have variable overdrive according to the literature I've seen from Asus ROG presentations. There were some sort of online live streams which I attended, and it was specifically mentioned that it does have variable overdrive. But just having variable overdrive doesn't mean it's well implemented. I don't know how well implemented the pixel overdrive is on that model. But on this one, as I've said, honestly, I find it quite nicely tuned with the normal setting, at least when you're in the triple digits, and certainly 120 Hz and above, but definitely, you're at your kind of 150 Hz and above. Really very solid experience there. But even at these lower refresh rates, I don't find the overdrive extreme. And with Adaptive Sync active, you do still benefit from that lack of tearing and stuttering, which is really nice. Adaptive Sync will work all the way down to 48 Hz on AMD FreeSync. With my NVIDIA GPU, it's a little bit higher, and it depended on what static refresh rate you'd set. So if you have it set to 170 Hz, it went down to 55 Hz. That really isn't a huge difference anyway, but it's worth bearing in mind. And if you have it set to 120 Hz, I believe it was 52 Hz it went down to, the floor of operation. 100 Hz, I believe it would go down to 50 Hz. And when it goes below that, the monitor goes below that, you still get a reduction in tearing and stuttering because LFC, low frame rate compensation, or an LFC-like behavior is used, and that means that the monitor with its refresh rate will stick to a multiple of the frame rate. So if the game was to run at 35 frames a second, the monitor would be running at 70 Hz, and that occurs with both NVIDIA and AMD GPUs. There is a bit of a stuttering when LFC activates or deactivates. That is something which isn't specific to this monitor. It's something which I observe universally actually on adaptive sync models. It isn't extreme stuttering, but I just mention it because if you're frequently passing that boundary, the floor of operation, either side of it, then that could become bothersome. But for the most part, if you're just doing it occasionally, just occasionally passing that, then it's not something I'd worry about. But whilst I'm at 60 Hz, I'm just going to disable adaptive sync and show you what things look like using the different overdrive settings here, just to show you that the offsetting is actually quite nice to have here. So I've now got the monitor running at a static 60 Hz refresh rate with the normal setting, and the overshoot is actually quite a bit more pronounced now than it was with adaptive sync active. At the higher refresh rates, the normal setting with adaptive sync disabled versus adaptive sync being used and enforcing this normal-like setting, it doesn't have a particularly pronounced difference, but I have to say in this particular scene, and at 60 Hz, there is actually some, I wouldn't necessarily call it extreme, but it's verging on extreme overshoot now. Really quite eye-catching. You might be able to see this on the video. I hope you can see it on the video, because to my eye, it's pretty eye-catching in places. Around the flag there, above the flag, you should be able to see this. So if you find yourself in this situation, 60 Hz, adaptive sync is deactivated, turn overdrive off. Whilst it says off, it doesn't necessarily mean it isn't using any pixel overdrive, it's just the lowest setting. They just call it off. But actually this is a natively rather fast panel anyway, it seems. So either way, the overshoot has gone now, and you don't get loads of powdery trailing or any trailing really in its place. It's actually nicely tuned for a decent experience at the 60 Hz refresh rate now, using the off setting. So again, it's a shame that you can't adjust the pixel overdrive with adaptive sync active, but at least I suppose adaptive sync did help a bit in reducing the overshoot. And just to round this section off, I'm now running at 170 Hz, and that's a static 170 Hz. Adaptive sync is off, and I'm using that off overdrive setting still, and I can clearly see that there is a lot of powdery trailing. Well, not a lot of powdery trailing, actually it's not terrible. I'm sorry, that was a bit exaggerated, but there is some powdery trailing. And the perceived blur overall is just increased because of this, bit increased. I would certainly stick to normal when you're up here. It's not a hard and fast rule, but 120 Hz plus on this model, I do much prefer the normal setting. Now with the normal setting, the overall perceived blur is reduced. And there is a little bit of overshoot, actually a bit more than with adaptive sync active, and that's what I mentioned. There's a bit of a change in the behavior with adaptive sync active versus not active, but there's nothing like what I was showing you before. This really isn't eye-catching overshoot, just slight overshoot in places. And I did mention I'd show you the extreme setting, and I'm true to my word. Here you go. Overdrive is set to extreme. Remember, the monitor's at 170 Hz. So that's where you would expect potentially the lowest overshoot. Well, with the extreme setting, you get very bright halo trailing. It almost appears brighter than the white of the sun up there. It technically shouldn't be, but it can appear that way. It just really stands out against the background. The flag there as well, showing some rather colourful and bright halo trailing. The clouds even now have this sort of dark silhouette around them. This dirty trailing, as I like to call it. It's darker than the sky shade. Really, this setting is just there for specification purposes, nothing more. But it probably seems like an age ago that I was talking about 170 Hz on this monitor with adaptive sync active and everything running very nicely. But just to remind you, I really was rather impressed by the high frame rate, high refresh rate experience on this monitor. To wrap up then, I do like the stand of this monitor. I know that's a bit of a strange place to start, but I do think it's worth mentioning that metal stand. And I do actually draw a few comparisons in the review between this and the Asus model, the PG329Q. And sort of a recurring thing I've noticed people mention who've tested both models is that they tend to prefer the overall construction of this Acer model They say it feels a bit more premium, and a large part of that is the stand. The stand really is nice and solid. Not just the base, but also the neck has a lot of metal on it, and it does give a good heft to the overall monitor. Of course, the main thing you're going to notice when you're using the monitor is the screen itself, and I enjoyed the large screen, a good immersive experience from the 32-inch screen. The pixel density wasn't incredible because of the fact that it has a 2560 by 1440 resolution, of course a lot lower than a 32 or 31.5 inch 4K UHD model of this size, and not quite as tight as a 27-inch WQHD model, but not awful by any stretch of the imagination. And that perhaps shouldn't be surprising. Most people are quite happy with a 24-inch Full HD monitor in terms of pixel density, and that's what this achieves as well. And also the fact the screen's flat, that does differentiate it between most of the competing models. And I say competing models, they're actually generally significantly cheaper than this, but the VA models, the high refresh rate VA models, I think it's a bit of an apples to oranges comparison actually. There are quite a lot of differences. I don't want to spend too long going through it in the conclusion here, but one thing is that the curve of the screen, that's a clear noticeable difference. The VA models are mainly curved, and not everyone likes the curved screen. And I do say that people often get put off by pictures and videos of curved monitors, but the experience is a bit different when you're sitting at a desk using it. The contrast experience was very much as I'd expect from an IPS type panel. Static contrast of around 1000 to 1, a bit above with some settings, a bit below with others, but really what I'd expect from the panel type. Moderate amount of IPS glow as well, again quite expected for the panel type, and that does eat away at some of the atmosphere, particularly if you're sitting in a dark room or a dim room and you're looking at darker content. And that's really an area where the VA models have a bit of an edge. And I say a bit of an edge, I mean, their static contrast is quite a bit stronger. But you also have to consider they do have their own issues. They've got VA glow, and I've seen a fair number of reports of some quite bad uniformity issues with the VA models, a lot of clouding, which can bring out that VA glow more strongly. I mean, that does vary between individual units, and even this model, although my unit was quite good, that there aren't any guarantees when it comes to that kind of thing. But it does seem that curving these VA models makes them a bit more prone to that kind of issue. And I've discussed this recently on my forum if you want to check out the posts about that. When it comes to colour reproduction, this monitor really does excel in many respects. It has a very generous colour gamut, has a quantum dot backlight solution, and does offer a very generous colour gamut. A lot of extension beyond sRGB, actually extension beyond Adobe RGB. I measured 100% Adobe RGB with some extension beyond that even. 95% DCI-P3, but in some regions with the DCI-P3 gamut, again, a lot of extension beyond, or a fair chunk of extension beyond. So this gives things a very vibrant and saturated look when you're looking at normal sRGB content. It does look oversaturated, it doesn't look as the developers intend, but it does still look varied, and some users really enjoy this extra vibrancy, and that definitely is delivered by this monitor. It also offers an effective sRGB emulation setting, and unlike some settings of that sort, you can adjust the brightness. And again, I like to compare with the Asus model, and from my research, it suggests that the sRGB emulation setting on that model does have locked brightness, so that is a difference to consider between the two. Another key strength of this monitor is the colour consistency, so you get that richness maintained throughout the screen, that saturation maintained at all parts of the screen. The gamma consistency is also strong, so this gives you a nicer experience than you'd get on the competing VA models, for example, and certainly compared to a TN model when you look at the vertical shifts on those. It means that the level of detail is better maintained. For darker scenes, you don't get the kind of black crush in the centre of the screen and some extra unintended detail towards the bottom of the screen or the sides of the screen. On VA models from a normal viewing position, especially ones of this size, you're going to see some of that, so you can't really escape that from a normal viewing position. But on this model, you don't have to worry about that, even if you're sitting, you're sitting, say, to 70 centimetres from the screen, 70 to 80 centimetres, you do get better consistency with both gamma and the colour saturation. And that again helps with the vibrant look, certainly does. The monitor also supports HDR, and that allows it to use this colour gamut more appropriately. With the DCI-P3 colour space that the developers have in mind in the shorter term, and Rec 2020 an even wider colour space for the longer term. And the colour gamut of this being generous and even extending beyond DCI-P3 in some regions, that actually work nicely in HDR. So you have a toned down look to those oversaturated shades. Things look more natural, things look more in place, whilst you also get some really nice vibrant shades which are very eye-catching and showcase a good range of shades well beyond the sRGB colour space and some beyond the DCI-P3 colour space. So where the developers want that saturation and that vibrancy, you get it, but where they want things to look more subdued, more natural, you get that kind of look as well. The monitor also supports local dimming, so it's VESA Display HDR 600 certified. The local dimming worked well actually. There were only 16 dimming zones, so it's not a massive number. Certainly for a monitor of this size and with this many pixels, you know, there's scope for a lot more precision with the dimming than that. But even so, it delivered a nice experience, which lifts it above what you normally get, which is 0 dimming zones or 1 dimming zone, so that's the entire backlight. It was well implemented by Acer, I feel, as well. It was very reactive and did work well to make sure that whilst there are some very eye-catching bright elements on some parts of the screen, the dimmer elements looked dimmer than they would if the whole of the backlight was just shining really brightly. 10-bit colour reproduction was also leveraged, although this was with the help of GPU dithering, because this is an 8-bit panel. But as I mentioned in the review, I don't have any issue with that. I've tested this a lot on various different monitors, and under HDR at least, the GPU dithering does its thing just fine. So the overall HDR experience on this one, I did actually rather like it. In terms of responsiveness, it actually impressed me in many respects as well. It offered a really solid 170Hz performance. Adaptive sync worked as well. It worked well on both my NVIDIA and AMD GPUs. My only real criticism, I suppose, in terms of responsiveness would be that they lock out the overdrive setting. If you're using adaptive sync, it sets it to normal. It's actually a bit better tuned than normal without adaptive sync active, but it's not a massive difference. And the issues can come when you're getting much lower frame rates, so your refresh rate is therefore setting itself to, under 100 Hz, let's say 60 Hz or so. That does give stronger overshoot. Whereas if you have adaptive sync disabled, you have the option of turning the overdrive to off, which is the weakest setting available on the monitor, and that actually gives a really solid 60 Hz performance, and it gets rid of the overshoot. So it would be nice to have a bit of flexibility with adaptive sync active, but I think especially with the higher refresh rates in mind, they've done a nice job at getting a lot out of the monitor in terms of its pixel responsiveness. Input lag was also nice and low, no problems there. So overall, I think this monitor can provide a nice immersive and engaging experience with some really eye-popping vibrancy, if you like that kind of thing, and the ability to use the colour gamut for creative purposes if you need to. If you're profiling the monitor, you can have really nice accurate reproduction within the sRGB colour space and Adobe RGB, and also very good DCI-P3 performance as well. So that's a really nice flexibility to have. I actually found the overall experience a lot nicer than any of the 32-inch VA models I've used. There were several reasons for that, and again, I don't want to go through them all here, but just for me, and monitors are very subjective, remember that, just for me, this hit the spot more in terms of its responsiveness, in terms of the colour output as well. And actually, just a little thing, I like the screen surface on this monitor. It does have a bit of sort of light misty graininess, as I call it, but I do like how light it is. It's what I would classify as very light matte anti-glare, so that's lighter than the VA models, and that gives more direct emission of light and sort of just has less of a layered appearance in front of the image. The VA models don't have a clear layered appearance, but there is a bit of a difference when you compare them to this one, and it is something that sensitive users like me can notice and appreciate. And finally, I enjoyed the HDR on the monitor. I did enjoy using it. It's a real litmus test for me if I use it, not just when I'm gaming, but also when I'm watching Netflix content and that kind of thing, because most HDR I will actually just leave disabled because really there's too much traded off going from SDR to HDR. But in this case, it was a very usable HDR, better than I've come across on any of the 32-inch VA models, actually, I'd say. Even though they have stronger static contrast, I actually think the dimming solution here, the local dimming, worked very well. And also the colour gamut and the colour performance really helped the HDR stand out as a good, solid HDR performance. So that's really all there is to the Acer XB323U GP. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.